Well, welcome everybody to the Sooner Safer Happier Meetup event. We are proud to welcome Simon Rohrer on stage. Simon is the head of enterprise technology architecture and ways of working at Saxo Bank in Copenhagen. And Simon has been a huge advocate of modern ways of working as a hands-on practitioner and coach, a special focus on technical excellence. Simon also co-author of Sooner Safer Happier, and he has an exciting talk for us today, Architecting for Outcomes. And so he's going to share his experiences and learnings on in the last few years on this topic. So with that, it's over to you, Simon.
Thanks so much, Jolt. Just let me get sharing working, and we are good. Cool. So a little bit more about my background, my journey to where I am now. I started 29 years ago now, 1994, as a software developer, designing submarine sonar systems way back when, writing Ada. And then Java back then as well. I actually still count myself as a developer. I then moved into the rarefied world of enterprise architecture. I was at Barclays for 15 years. My second to last job there was as chief architect for Barclays Wealth Management. My last job at Barclays was working with John Smart, Miles Ogilvy, and Jolt, amongst other luminaries. We started as an agile transformation team. We then became an agile adoption team, and then we decided it wasn't actually all about agile at all. It was just about modern ways of working to deliver better value, sooner, safer, and happier. And then Brexit happened, and I decided to go to a slightly more sane country and joined Saxo Bank in Copenhagen. And here I am combining things I love to do, and I love my job here. It's awesome. And I head up technology architecture and ways of working. So that includes a sort of technical modern ways of working, like continuous delivery, DevOps, and extreme programming and test-driven development, but also leading with outcomes and moving towards more product-oriented and outcome-focused business practices as well. Like I said, Barclays for 15 years, Saxo for 4 years now. I've been in Copenhagen for 4 years, and one of the co-authors with John of Sooner Safer Happier. So what we in the BVSSH world always like to ask is, well, what are you optimizing for? Looking at enterprise architecture, in particular, effectively architecture at an enterprise scale, what I've observed amongst a number of enterprise architecture practices that I've seen in my career and actually still see talking to other organizations with their enterprise architecture functions, is that traditional enterprise architecture outcomes are things like standards, making sure you only got one of something, being consistent about how you use those, supporting predictive planning. So where are we going to be in 18 months with this? And let's get a plan and stick to it, and then optimizing for, as a first order outcome, cost reduction. From a BVSSH point of view, architects shouldn't be looking to help businesses optimize these outcomes in the modern world. These are not the outcomes that we would recommend that you directly try and optimize for. Instead, the newer EA outcomes, well, they're not necessarily things you should be optimizing for directly either. You know, EA, let's get a cloud program together, let's implement microservices. Again, these are not sort of first order outcomes. They may help. They're not things that you should be directly optimizing for. Instead, align architecture and the outcomes of any architecture initiatives to business agility, all in the same direction towards better, value, sooner, safer, and happier. You guys are along for a BVSSH meetup. I'm pretty sure you know all this stuff, but I will just reiterate, as we like to say, communicate 3 more times than you think you need to, and then you're a third of the way there. So I'm going to go through this again. Hopefully it's not too boring for you. Better is quality. Sooner is flow. It's not faster, but it is sooner, and it's flow between concept to validation, concept to cache, concept to customer, idea to actually getting it in front of that customer and experimenting with it. Safer is the things that keep you in business, that are keeping the security wolves from your door, or data privacy from the GDPR or a local regulator perspective, and minimum viable compliance. Agile, not fragile, but not a bureaucratic overhead. And for those who've read Sooner, Safer, Happier, we talk about our journey with safety teams, and again, pulling in the same direction rather than being people who say no. Happier, of course, is not just happier customers, although they're important. It's happier colleagues and citizens and climate, and then value there in the center. It's what makes you unique, whether that's handbags or savings accounts or mortgages. That's your OKRs, that's what you're measuring, what you're delivering that's special for your organization. So again, I probably don't need to tell most of you this. The way that we as high-performing organizations collaborate to deliver technology has changed. In the 2000s and before then, even, we delivered software and we delivered value through software slowly. We'd spend months planning, writing down requirements, analyzing them and doing a high-level design. We'd then spend several more months doing some detailed design and development, and we'd throw, something over the wall from one team to another, and we'd throw it over to yet another team who were responsible for quality, and then another team who'd spend a few weeks working out how to get this stuff into production in front of customers, and then some poor operations team get to own this software forever. But again, that's not how we work now. We know how to do things radically faster. And this isn't just a quantitative change in how fast each of those phases works. It's a qualitative change in how we build, and things get to idea to in front of customers in days or potentially even hours for the high-performing teams. And we don't have silos anymore. We have a team that works together, a product team that develops and operates the software and learns. But many architecture departments still think we are on the left rather than on the right, and the way they operate still thinks we work in phases with handoffs, and is no longer the case. So I'm going to focus on one major outcome here and talk about architecting for flow. One of the things that can really radically change your business is, again, getting from concept to cash instead of in 18 months to in weeks or days. Winston Churchill gave this great quote when the Houses of Parliament were being rebuilt after bombing in the Second World War. He was offered, and the government were offered, to have a newer design, a more European design, to have a parliament that was a bit more consensual and in the round. And Churchill said, no, I want this just rebuilt as this two sets of benches opposing one another at a sword's length, because I still want an adversarial parliament. And the shape of our buildings, well, it shapes how we are, is what he said. Gene Kim recast that quote about software architectures. He said, we shape our architectures and thereafter they shape us. He goes on to say, the systems we build become larger and larger, and anybody in any sizable enterprise will recognize this. The level of coordination we need to do for any substantial change increases. We used to be able to build things with a few people, and then we needed a few teams, and then we need teams of teams of teams. And if we're not careful, the coordination grows so large that all our time is spent coordinating instead of delivering value. Complexity and coordination is something that enterprise architects have been thinking about for a long time. This diagram comes from a guy called Roger Sessions, who was an enterprise architecture writer. I tried to track him down on Twitter. He's now retired and runs a meditation retreat. Good for him. Maybe there's a lesson for all of us there, but hey, I am still practicing the old enterprise architecture for now, at least. This is a diagram from Roger Sessions that is a sort of model of the complexity of typical moderate to large enterprise architecture sizes. This looked very much, although there are 400 rather than about 20 services, it looks very much like the architecture that I inherited when I joined Saxo Bank 4 years ago. We're a 30-year-old organization, nowhere near as old as the previous organization I was at. Effectively, you've got business services in blue, technical services in green, and data stores, databases at the bottom, and typically an unguided architecture, enterprise level. Everything talks to everything else, and it is really unmanaged complexity. And it's that sort of coordination overhead that Jin Kim talks about our architecture shaping that high degree of coordination. You know, this is the simple thing to do. I just want that data. I'll just go to the database that it's in, and I'll just grab that. That's fine. That's my short-term view. And then, well, next time I'll just go to the other place where the data is, and I end up with this web of complexity that, again, the coordination starts to overrun value delivery. So an anti-pattern that we talk about in the book, and a lot of people start to talk about, is scaling our ways of working to manage dependencies, to say, okay, scaling is all about dependency management. It's all about coordination. But regardless of how much good practices, how much scaled agility or other scaling methods you try and throw at this, there is no running away from the fact that coordination overheads reduce your agility. So an example I like to throw out there, this is in the book, something similar to it is just Hello World. The typical sort of toy program. So if you've got a typical complex architecture and way of building systems in your organization, that includes, just going to go back there, that includes a user interface and a team that builds that, and an API layer and a team that looks after that, and a couple of services that need to coordinate to deliver different bits. And a DBA team looking after the database, then, well, even for something as simple as Hello World, you can't go to one of those teams and ask them to implement it. You need a team of solution architects to say, how you're going to decompose that and what work you're going to give to the different teams. Great, I've got an idea, concept that I need to turn into some cash. Hello World, please, solution architects, can you tell me how that works? Well, greeting service needs to write the hello bit, the planet service needs to write the world bit, API layer need to build something that then the UI layer can wrap around and add that sort of chrome of a little exclamation mark and some quotes. And there's going to be a hello world table, except it's got a weird naming convention because that's how the DBAs work to persist that message. And then, well, those teams can't test that themselves either because they don't own any single one of those. So great, we've got something that comes out that looks a little bit like Hello World. It's close enough. Testing team might log a minor defect against that, but then that can go live maybe a few weeks or a few months after I have that idea. But that's not ideal at all. We want to minimize dependencies. We want to break them. We can't ever reduce and remove every single dependency because we work in systems, and these systems collaborate to deliver value, but we need to minimize the dependencies wherever we can. So Roger Sessions, the ex-enterprise architect, the now meditation retreat runner, he talked about software fortresses back in 2002, 21 years ago now, just after the Agile Manifesto was written, and he effectively invented microservices about 10 years before some human, and James Lewis actually came up with the term. And he said you need 10 different characteristics of software that's going to break or at least minimize dependencies. You need teams to have autonomy about how they write their software. You need very, very explicit boundaries. You need to partition some functionality and define dependencies based on that functionality. Really important one that we're still learning lessons from today. Your services should communicate in an asynchronous way by default. If one of them fails, then the other shouldn't fail. It should stay up until the other one comes back up. Data working out, and again, this is even before Eric Evans came up with domain-driven design, which is at the heart of the microservices architecture. So Roger Sessions says you need to partition your data very clearly by business function. No transactions, security, again, still a very, very major concern. That trust is inside. Most of all, radical simplicity, which again we find very, very hard to do from an architecture perspective. So he wrote this book, Simple Architectures for Complex Enterprises, which has not been taken up anywhere near as much as some. But Roger Sessions is really a pioneer here. But I'll talk a bit more. He's not the only sort of thinker in this space. So refactoring that architecture, well, you don't just cut the architecture, it's architecture and organization. John is talking a lot about sort of socio-technical work and socio-technical processes rather than just technical ones. And Mel Conway talked about this back in the 60s. We talk about it in Sooner, Safer, Happier. To get faster flow, you need to think together about your organization and your architecture. So this hello world, well, great. Now we've got something that can deliver that quickly. We've got a user interface, a service, and a database that just belongs to this one team who are able to deliver value fast. And so great, we've got a way of fixing all of this. Awesome, but it's at the end of the story. It's not quite the end of the story. If we go from just the picture on the left to the picture on the right, well, have we gained much? We've taken those sort of big services and turned them into lots of small services, but we've still got the same amount of connections. We've still got the complexity there. And there is this, again, an anti-pattern that is great. We've got microservices, now we're done. And that's far from correct. There's a bunch of ideas that, again, started a very, very long time ago. Parnas talking about modular design in 72, Code and Jordan talking about structured design in 1979. Software fortresses from Roger Sessions in 2002 and evolved that into the Snowman architecture, but then also Eric Evans talking about domain-driven design, 10 deploys a day from Flickr in 2009, which then drove the DevOps movement. Like I said, Sam Newman and James Lewis coining microservices in 2011. Dan North talking about software that fits in your head. Mel Conway back in 67. Topologies, inspired by, well, pretty much all of those things in 2019. These are all sort of inspirations for how we architect and organize in the modern world. The diagram to the left is, well, the process, the DevOps process, that includes rapid value to customer, the architecture around these modules, communicate, and the team that is able to build and run them. All of these things are the key to a modern architecture for flow. I talk about microservices theatre. This is a picture that Monzo, the UK neobank, published of their microservices architecture. I think there's around 1,600 different microservices here. As an exercise to the reader, I'm not at all certain that this is a low complexity, high cohesion architecture at all. For me, well, maybe I don't leave it as an exercise to the reader. I'm a bit opinionated. I think this is just as complex as any of the legacy banks. So the pattern against those anti-patterns is evolutionary architecture, and we talk a lot about that in Sooner, Safer, Happier, towards autonomous technical modules, autonomous business modules, and autonomous teams. So in Saxo, we are evolving. We started with something that looked, like I said, a lot like that. I started 4 years ago, and slowly but surely we are reducing the complexity. We are componentizing things into better modules and the teams that look after them. And that journey is going to take time. It's probably a 10-year journey, if not longer. But everything we do slowly adds value, and not just adds value, but also adds happiness to the teams. It gives them autonomy, and all of the good Dan Pink stuff about mastering purpose as well. So a good HBR article on taming complexity that at its surface has nothing to do with tech, but it's very much applicable to enterprise architecture. Creating and reducing complexity sound like opposites. They sound like they're symmetrical, but there's some entropy in here. There's real asymmetry. Creating complexity is easy, and reducing complexity is actually really, really hard. We might think that a sort of traditional architecture governance can come to the rescue here, what enterprise architects have typically done. But again, there's another anti-pattern here. Maybe people have seen this architecture review boards. They come in different names, architecture forums, design boards, design authorities, but all effectively doing the same thing, and aligned to how we used to deliver projects. Let's initiate, plan, execute, and close, a sort of waterfall analysis, design, build, and test, aligned to the project life cycle. And great, the architecture board had a nice slot there. They actually had 2 slots. They could review a high-level design, and then they could review a detailed design, and then they could act as a star chamber and rubber stamp and say, yes, that's great. Of course, the teams would then go away and build something entirely different. But at least the architecture board thought that they had rubber stamped something that then get executed. With modern delivery in an agile or lean, even if we're in project mode rather than product mode, then we have a rapid initiation, a kickoff of the project, which might take a couple of days, and then we do pretty much everything else in parallel. We analyze all the time, we test, design, and build all the time, and we keep on releasing. So, well, where does the architecture board sit there? Where have they got actually anything substantial to review? And the answer is, well, it's a trick question. They haven't at all. There isn't a single design artifact that's given up front that has anything material that can be reviewed there. And certainly when we move from project to product, we're delivering value continuously. So the architecture board simply has no means to operate in its traditional sense. Instead, we can give an architecture as a black box. We can actually say, well, what are we actually doing? I think I need a new service. Well, great. Do you need a new service as enterprise architecture? Is that adding complexity? Going back to that sort of asymmetry of creating complexity is easy and taking it away is hard. So even building a brand new service adds complexity to the organization and could potentially reduce the overall flow. It's potentially better to build something in an existing service, to add functionality to something that teams are already used to working with. Maybe it isn't, but let's talk together about whether that needs to be done. Adding links between services. Again, the more links, the more coordination, the more overhead, the more complexity. So again, how we govern EA in a modern sense is to approve these, and not to approve them on a piece of paper and say, hey, your PowerPoint looks awesome, go away and do that. But no, we actually get to say, yes, you are allowed to talk to that service, or you're not. Let's think about another way to do this. And finally, just ways of connecting, as we said, back in Project Sessions is 2002 paper, and still we want that sort of different asynchronous way of connecting for resilience as much as anything, but maybe you've got a good reason you can't do that, and again, we can approve that as an exception, or maybe just tech debt for you to fix later on. And I don't know why that finished. There we go. So paved paths for quality, security, and flow. So you want to do something that is out of the ordinary. Again, you're going to need to have a conversation with us. You want to follow standard ways of building. Cool. We can do that. And you can get from your idea, approval that you need a brand new service, into a production environment in less than a day. Again, going back to what we saw in the Blue Bank we used to work for, before we'd changed the governance process there, just getting a hello world took 64 elapsed days. Hello world from approval into production, 64 days, and now you can do it in less than a day. So the other pattern here is conversation. For those who are students of Agile, there were a number of names floated at the Snowbird conference for what was then the sort of lightweight new methodology. Martin Fowler wrote a paper in 2000 called the new methodology. At that point, actually, his preference was to call it adaptive software development. Unfortunately, Jim Highsmith, who was one of the attendees at Snowbird, already had a copyrighted methodology called adaptive, so that couldn't be used. Kent Beck actually wanted to call it conversation software development, and that goes alongside how Kent Beck uses user stories. It says it's a promise for conversation. I really like that, and that is certainly how I encourage architecture, instead of this star chamber, this one-off review process, which, as I said, is not even practical in the modern world. Architecture and doing architecting at enterprise levels and below is about talking. It's about talking to teams and understanding what they want to achieve. So instead of, if we're in agile project mode, instead of having a one-off conversation at the start, then no, instead we have a continuous conversation, and we have a bunch of people who are working together, a community of practice of architects who can work with teams, can coach them, can understand what they're doing, and add to the body of knowledge for the entire organization. Again, this is something we talk about in chapter 6 of Sooner, Safer, Happier, in the safety teams context, and not just in the context of architecture, but in the context of security, data privacy, regulation as well. Same is true when we're operating in product mode. We talk to teams, and we help them deliver what they need. So effectively, that continuous conversational governance it's DevOps at enterprise scale. So architects are doing the same sort of things. They're not necessarily writing code directly, although occasionally they might be writing infrastructure as code, or configuration, or policy as code. And that architecture center of excellence, the enterprise architects, and the community of practice of just people who practice architecture in a day-to-day alongside their development jobs, they're working with those teams and building out that architecture for flow. It's bigger than normal DevOps because it's an enterprise scope rather than team scope. It has a much longer term time frame. Alongside that, again, a pattern that I've found good and I've seen work well is working very closely alongside service management organizations. Where I've seen previously, enterprise architects and service management organizations don't talk or aren't aligned at the hip, well, bad things happen. So finally, we align this with the conversation around value streams. And effectively, we see the teams owning those autonomous business capabilities, those services as microservices. We see them as the lowest level of value stream. They deliver value. They have something independent that they can deliver, but then they're nested within a value stream, which then is nested again, potentially in a bigger value stream or a business unit, and then nested again in an organization. And again, it's this continuous collaboration at these fractal levels of cooperation. Thanks. That's it. Any questions? Any Jolt? How do we want to run this?
Yes, exactly. So thank you so much, Simon. This was really exciting. So it's open for questions. Anybody, any questions?
Shall I go?
Please.
So yeah, really interesting what you're saying there, Simon, about the continuous conversational governance piece. And I'm just wondering, is there any thinking around the use of AI in that at all? I've just actually looked through the Student Safe App here book to see if it references AI, artificial intelligence. I can't see it, but it might do.
It doesn't yet. Maybe in a further edition. I think certainly since we have started looking at this, so I'm going to shoot from the hip here. I've been using ChatGPT a little from a sort of software perspective. I don't think it is there yet, unfortunately, not even at sort of the lowest level of being able to write software. There are some places where it can write some algorithms. There are others where it fails miserably. I tried to write some testing, some Docker testing harnesses, and it was about 2 years out of date with the libraries it recommended, and they just fell over. I think potentially large language models could help in maybe 5, maybe 10 years time with the way they're evolving. I don't believe so right now. I think this is ultimately down to people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Thank you. Yeah, I think I was thinking specifically around the architecting for outcomes piece, making those decisions as to, yeah, whether you're going to build something onto something you've already got, or whether you're going to create something new, whether there's any role there, particularly for AI.
Yeah, I think where AI is good is where there are large data sets of similar decisions. And I mean, and by large, I mean huge, but in the hundreds of millions of examples to go by. I think in architecting, there aren't. Every business is, has its unique snowflake characteristics. Every, and even those evolve. So the amount of data needed to sort of feed AI decision making in those cases is not there, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Simon.
Andrew.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sticking my physical hand up there. This kind of presentation, Simon, is really good, by the way, and really engaging presentation and set of slides. It's you're obviously going to have to try and cast the net as wide as you can, and then therefore it's not specific to when you get into particular case studies. One of the things I always struggle with in where I work is that we're actually really quite a small part of a larger organization, and looking at these kind of patterns, I'm always thinking about how do I map this onto people, because largely a lot of places you have the team you have the things you need to do, and trying to actually look at your systems and trying to come up with an architecture and then map that onto teams that are responsible for those things. I don't know if there's anything you could talk to there in your experience with, I guess, have you got the same set of people managing multiple, I don't know what you call those things again, where you've got the databases and the green blobs and the blue blobs together, but do people managing more than one of those things in an environment or something like that? That's a really terribly worded question, but hopefully that makes some sense.
No, it does make sense. I mean, those things you can call them modules, microservices. Roger Sessions calls them, well, he evolved from sort of snowmen to autonomous business capabilities. I quite like ABCs, but they're effectively microservices in the sort of best design sense. Do you typically have, now this is really interesting, Team Topologies had a great presentation, Matt and Miguel at DevOps Enterprise Summit 2019, I think it was, about, again, taking on from Dan North's software that fits inside your head. And they said, effectively, that the software team owns should fit in its own head. And do you want to build a monolith that's about the size of your team? Well, that's cool. You know, you want to slice that into multiple services, sure. But just make sure you have the cognitive load as a team. And again, it's typically, I don't know if you've read Team Topologies, but they recommend a team of about 9. You know, that sort of Scrum size team, make sure the software fits in that team's cognitive load to be able to manage. Does that help at all? It
does. I think it's a longer conversation, maybe.
No. I mean, feel free. We've got time. So please follow up. I mean, so you were talking about sort of mapping software to teams. Is that something? And again, sorry, is that something that you were trying to do as an exercise, that you don't know who owns the software, or that you do?
Yeah, it's more. I'll be very, very specific, actually. And sorry for everybody else on the call.
No.
It's boring, but so my team we look after 4 sites across the globe. And we're a small team. We're about 20 people. And a lot of what we do is like physical technology. So everything from the cables coming into each of the buildings to the Wi-Fi and the servers, etc. But also we've started doing some software development. And there's always a challenge when you look at anything that is product thinking or agile thinking or anything modern, I would say, Team Topologies too, is trying to map that onto our specific setup. And understanding, what the optimum setup of that team would be to manage all of these different things. So you've got now a lot of, for example, a lot of the presentations and things that I've seen talk about software architecture, and it's actually quite a well-known, well-documented space. Even when you look at infrastructure as code, that kind of thing. But when you're going to physical infrastructure, or you're looking at teams that are managing, they're configuring more than developing, and you're trying to work out what the architecture of that should be. Plus, again, as I say, like starting to move into doing some product development where we're seeing gaps and how we should set off on that journey. There's always seems to be a bit of a gap for me in terms of actually mapping some of this stuff into my space. Again, this is like this isn't a clinic for me. But
I hear you, and again, it's something that resonates with me. We've got sort of in particular, we have a network team in our enterprise platforms team who their day-to-day job, and certainly the more senior members of the team, their comfort zone is cabling things and big switches. Absolutely, but they are still a platform team. They still own effectively a shared service value stream to the rest of the organization. They deliver that networks are valuable, otherwise we wouldn't be spending so much money with Cisco or Palo Alto. So yeah, I mean, again, see what they're delivering to the team, see what skills you need to be able to do that. If you're evolving some software to help with that, that stuff is interesting, because sort of being able to be fungible when you're used to being a person who cables networks, and now somebody's asking you to write Python scripts or Terraform code or Lua for load balancers. It's an interesting conundrum to try and cross-skill the team correctly. And actually, we've ended up having 2 teams, one of whom are sort of more modern facing and doing automation and software, and one of whom who are sort of more comfortable in the traditional boxes and cables. They're still doing network, but actually just being able to even manage backlogs of stuff for them. The physical stuff is more amenable to a Gantt chart, whereas the software stuff is more amenable to a backlog.
Yeah, that's great.
Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pete.
So as far as like like you've basically sort of shown a nice picture where you have different outcome teams that are very empowered and they sort of define, work within their outcome focus. And then we sort of talk about like different outcome teams talking to each other. If each outcome team sort of is empowered to like define the way you communicate to them, that puts a lot of cognitive load on the teams that have to talk to maybe 2 or 3. It also means it's going to be difficult to build like a level of resilience within the organization that we don't have any, standards around, how to talk to each other. One person we want to talk by messaging. We want to use services. Like there's all sorts of different approaches. How do you sort of balance the empowered teams versus like, having maybe some standards or maybe just best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that we are very keen on. Effectively, this is again, it's designing at fractal levels. So how can teams talk to one another? Actually, we are restrictive about that. That is a standard, and it's outside the black box. So the black box says within your little snowman, your autonomous business capability, you have a reasonable amount of freedom. Actually, for us here in Saxo, we have 2 ways of communicating by standards, and even actually, frankly, one, which is Kafka. You want to use gRPC, that's a sort of blessed request response, but you shouldn't really be doing request response. You want to do something other than those 2, you've got to come up with a real good reason for it. So absolutely, no. The chaos of communication between the black boxes, we want to 100% avoid that. So how you talk to other teams, again, team topologies, the evolution of even the team has a sort of team API, but physical communication between services, yeah, that is an EA decision. It isn't a team decision.
Yeah, we're going to end up with a couple of those things. Like, let's say we decide on X for, we got to deal with Oracle versus, Google or whatever, right? There's certain like, scaling decisions that, we don't want to have 16 licenses with 16 vendors for databases. We want to have, 1 or 2. So same sort of thing is
exactly. So it's the 2 levels of decision. Again, we talk about black box versus white box architecture. The anti-pattern we had seen previously in not just the big financial services organization we work for, but also many others that we spoke to, was that nobody was distinguishing between which Java library do you want to download from Maven to do number formatting versus the sort of massive scale outside the black box technologies. And we just said, no, there's a clear distinction here. Within the box, you have freedom. Outside the box, you don't.
okay. That's awesome. Okay, and great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Laura?
Yes, hi. So I have a question around really how do you measure the success of the architecture decisions? And, especially with, in my organization, we're moving to the cloud. So we're making a lot of decisions about new services that we're implementing and really understanding, was that the right way to go? And is it more efficient?
Yeah. I'm going to be very glib and then not so glib. Of course, you've read the book. How do you measure any of this? Well, it's the balanced scorecard of better value, sooner, safer, happier. Some of these decisions will take some time to play out. So, I talk about us implementing Kafka, and that is moving away from a sort of direct a mess of service to database connections. But that's again the thing we talk about in the book is there's an S curve that's going to slow some teams down for a while before it speeds them up. So you can measure this, but some of the improvements are going to be over a sort of geological time period. They're going to be great. In 2 years' time, this is going to make things awesome. So some of this, unfortunately, has to be done on faith. The fact that you really, really can't see other organizations who've managed to go radically faster doing this kind of thing. Some of it you'll get from, you know, your early adopters, the teams who are doing the early part of the evolution, and you can demonstrate through proof there. And again, we absolutely have this. We have teams who've moved from releasing once every 2 to 4 weeks to releasing many times a day, and releasing value many times a day. So, like I said, some of it on faith, but really some of it through both early proof and seeing other organizations following similar architectures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I think it just validates what I was thinking, and just being able to explain that then to leadership is really important. But sometimes it does take time. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Next question, anybody? No more questions. Thank you so much, Simon. It was really awesome.
Thank
So we're gonna
you.
have the recording. We're gonna share it on our YouTube channel and on LinkedIn. And we're gonna have new sessions coming up. So Matt shared the feedback. Please give us feedback. Also, there's gonna be a view of what's coming. Exciting talks, and as well as open space for the community. So thank you so much.